Nori never imagined that serving coffee every day to a quiet old man would change her life forever. Walter showed up at 7:13 in the morning, always with the same order, the same kind look. Until the day he stopped coming. 3 weeks later, lawyers walked into the diner with impossible news. He'd left her his house. And along with the inheritance came his grandson, a stranger carrying guilt, regret, and something neither of them was ready to feel. If you're feeling something with this story, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're listening from right now. Your stories matter too. How many times have you felt invisible? Like your choices didn't matter, like you only existed to take care of everyone else and never yourself. Nori lived that. Many of you have too. I've pinned something in the comments that talks exactly about this. About recognizing yourself again. It's not for everyone. Only for those who still believe they deserve more. Morning light filtered through the dusty diner windows like a timid promise, painting the formica tables in golden tones that Nori knew by heart. It was 6:50 in the morning, and she'd already been there for 40 minutes preparing the coffee with the same meticulous precision as always. The rich aroma filled every corner of the narrow space, mixing with the smell of melted butter and toasted bread. There was something comforting about that routine, something that kept her anchored in a world that, for a long time, had seemed to crumble around her. At 7:13, sharp, like a Swiss watch that never failed, the door opened with the soft jingle of the bell hanging from the frame. Walter walked in slowly with measured steps that echoed across the black and white checkered floor. He always wore the same brown coat, worn at the elbows, the same felt hat covering perfectly combed white hair. But it was his eyes that Nori could never ignore, clear as spring water, carrying a presence that needed no words. "Good morning, Walter," she said, feeling the smile come naturally to her lips as she reached for the white porcelain cup he preferred. "Good morning, dear Nori." His voice was soft, weathered by time, but steady. There was kindness in that greeting, a quiet tenderness that warmed something inside her. Black coffee, 2 spoons of sugar, no cream. She didn't even need to ask. Her fingers worked on autopilot as she prepared the drink exactly the way he liked it, watching the sugar crystals dissolve on the dark surface like tiny constellations disappearing into the liquid universe. Walter sat at the counter, on the same faded red padded stool that creaked slightly under his weight. He never ordered anything beyond that coffee, never complained, never demanded attention. He was just there, a constant presence that Nori had learned to value more than she could explain. "How was your day yesterday?" she asked, resting her elbows on the counter as she watched the steam rise from his cup in lazy spirals. Walter smiled, that subtle smile that lit up his eyes before his lips. "Peaceful. Read a bit. Walked in the park. Watched people live their lives." He paused, his fingers wrapping around the cup with reverent care. "And you, my dear? How's your heart doing?" The question caught her off guard, as it always did. Walter had this peculiar gift of asking questions that mattered, that cut through the surface and touched places she kept locked away. Nori looked away for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of loneliness tighten in her chest. "I'm fine," she lied gently, wiping the counter with a damp cloth just to give her hand something to do. Walter didn't push. He never pushed. He just nodded, as if he understood perfectly what she couldn't say. And maybe he did. There was an ancient wisdom in those eyes, an understanding that came from having lived long enough to recognize the silent pains of others. They stayed like that for 23 minutes. Nori knew because she always checked the clock when he left. 23 minutes of comfortable silence, interrupted only by the rustling of the newspaper Walter read carefully and the distant noise of the city's traffic waking up. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full of mutual respect, of genuine presence. The rare kind of connection that doesn't need words to exist. When Walter finally stood up, he left $3 on the counter. Always the exact amount, never less, never more. He adjusted his hat with an old-fashioned elegance that seemed to belong to another era. "See you tomorrow, Nori." "See you tomorrow, Walter." She watched his silhouette disappear through the door, swallowed by the growing morning light. There was something comforting in the certainty that he'd be back. At 7:13. Like always. But Nori didn't know that would be their last "see you tomorrow." Didn't know that 3 weeks later, everything would change in a way she could never predict. Didn't know that Walter's grandson, a man named Jack, wearing a suit too expensive for that humble diner, would show up with lawyers, carrying an impossible truth that would turn her life upside down. Didn't know that Walter had seen something in her that she couldn't see in herself. That he had watched during all those silent coffees the way she treated every customer with dignity, how she cleaned the tables with care, how she never let anyone feel invisible. And she didn't know, as she put away Walter's still warm cup that ordinary morning, that she was about to receive not just a house, but a legacy that would teach her the true meaning of being seen, valued, and loved. The doorbell jingled again when another customer walked in. Nori smiled automatically, reached for another cup, and went on with her day. Just another morning at the diner. Or so she thought. 3 weeks and 2 days. That was exactly how long it took for Nori's world to crumble and rebuild itself in a way she could never have imagined possible. Walter didn't come back the next day, or the day after. His absence was a palpable hole in the diner's air, an emptiness that Nori felt every time she looked at the clock showing 7:13 and saw the faded red stool remain empty. She made his coffee anyway, black coffee, 2 spoons of sugar, no cream, just to feel like there was still some normalcy in a world that inexplicably seemed to have lost a bit of its color. It was Margaret, the elderly lady who always ordered toast with strawberry jam, who brought the news. "Did you hear about Mr. Caldwell?" she asked with that trembling voice that carried the weight of shared sadness. Nori's heart stopped for a full second. "Walter? Passed in his sleep, dear. Last week. They say it was peaceful." The cup Nori was holding slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor into 1,000 pieces of white porcelain, just like something inside her. The following days were a foggy blur of automatic movements. She kept working, serving coffee, cleaning tables, smiling mechanically at customers. But something fundamental had changed. The certainty of 7:13 in the morning had disappeared, and with it, an anchor Nori didn't even know she needed. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sun was beginning to tilt lazily in the sky, that they appeared. 3 men in suits walked into the diner as if they were entering a corporate boardroom. 2 carried leather briefcases and impenetrable professional expressions. The third made the air disappear from Nori's lungs the exact moment their eyes met. He was tall, broad shoulders filling out a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. Dark brown hair perfectly styled, a sharp jawline covered by stubble that looked more intentional than careless. But it was his eyes that held her. Light blue, exactly like Walter's, but carrying a different pain, sharper, more recent. A pain mixed with something that seemed dangerously close to guilt. "Nori Chen?" His voice was deep, controlled, but there was a subtle crack there, like glass about to break. "Yes?" She wiped her hands instinctively on her apron, feeling every muscle in her body tense under the weight of those stares. "My name is Jack Caldwell." He swallowed hard, and Nori saw his Adam's apple move up and down with difficulty. I was Walter Caldwell's grandson." The world tilted slightly on its axis. Was. That word confirmed what she already knew but hadn't fully processed yet. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Nori murmured, and she meant every word. She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him about the silent coffees, about Walter's rare kindness, about how he'd been the only constant on days that sometimes felt endless. But the words died in her throat. "We need to talk," Jack said, and there was a contained urgency in his voice that instantly put her on alert. "About my grandfather's will." The lawyers spread out through the diner like crows landing on unfamiliar territory. Nori led them to a table in the back, away from the few customers who remained, feeling her heart beat irregularly against her ribs. She had nothing to do with wills, had nothing to do with inheritances or legacies or legal matters. She was just a waitress who served coffee to a kind man every morning, wasn't she? One of the lawyers, a man with glasses and a serious, efficient expression, opened a briefcase and pulled out documents that seemed too important to be there, in that simple diner with its formica tables and checkered floor. "Miss Chen," he began in a professional, distant voice, "Walter Caldwell, in his will dated 6 months ago, left you his residence located at 412 Maple Street, including all its belongings and contents. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that Nori could hear the distant hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the hypnotic tick-tock of the wall clock. "I'm sorry," she finally managed to articulate, her voice coming out higher than normal. "You said, a house?" "His house," Jack interrupted, and there was something intense in his gaze now. Something between admiration and resentment that she couldn't decipher. "My grandfather left his house to you. That's impossible." Nori shook her head, feeling the world spin slightly. "I barely knew him. I just served him coffee. Every morning. That was all. Apparently," the lawyer continued, unmoved by her confusion, "it wasn't just that to Mr. Caldwell. He was quite specific in his wishes." Jack leaned forward then, his forearms resting on the table, and Nori could feel the heat emanating from him, could see the tension in his neck muscles, the way his fingers interlaced with contained force. "He left this for you," Jack said quietly, pulling a yellowed envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. Nori's hands trembled as she took the envelope. She recognized that handwriting, had seen Walter write in his newspaper a few times, elegant and careful letters from another era. She opened it reverently, like opening something sacred, and began to read. "Dear Nori, if you're reading this, it means I've passed. Don't be sad. I lived a long life and in recent years found peace in the simplest moments, especially in those 23 minutes every morning with you. I'm giving you the house because you treated it like a home before you even knew it existed. You treated me like I mattered when the rest of the world barely noticed my presence. You never asked for anything, never expected anything, just offered kindness, because that's your nature. The house isn't a burden. It's a possibility. What you do with it is your choice. But I hope, and this is my last selfish wish, that you'll allow it to be a place where others can feel seen, just as you made me feel. Jack needs to learn this. Maybe you can teach him. Maybe not. But the house is yours. Not because you tried to deserve it, but because you already deserved it without knowing. With all my affection, Walter." The tears fell before Nori could stop them, staining the old ink. She looked up and found Jack staring at her with an intensity that made her tremble, as if he was trying to understand a riddle his grandfather had left behind. "I can't accept this," Nori whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "You don't have a choice," Jack responded, and there was something in the way he watched her, something between reluctant admiration and raw vulnerability, that made the air between them crackle with an unfamiliar tension. "My grandfather always knew exactly what he was doing." And in that moment, with Walter's letter still in her trembling hands and Jack's impossible blue eyes fixed on her, Nori realized that her life had just changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. Nori stood in front of 412 Maple Street for a full 5 minutes before finding the courage to climb the porch steps. The house was exactly as she'd imagined it would be. A modest 2-story Victorian with white paint gently peeling at the edges and a front yard that clearly missed Walter's careful hands. There was something melancholic and welcoming at the same time about that structure, like a hug from someone you've lost but can still feel. The key was heavy in her hand, the metal cold against her sweaty palm. Jack had insisted she take it immediately, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second when he made the transfer. An accidental touch that had sent a strange current running up her arm. She'd pretended not to notice. So had he. Taking a deep breath, Nori turned the key in the lock. The door opened with a soft creak, like a welcoming sigh, and the smell that greeted her almost knocked her down. Old books, residual coffee, aged wood, and something indefinable that was purely Walter. She had to hold on to the doorframe for a moment, letting the wave of emotion pass before entering. The living room was exactly as she'd imagined a man like Walter would live. Dark wooden bookshelves occupied 2 entire walls, filled with books whose spines were worn from frequent handling. A brown leather armchair worn on the arms was positioned near the window overlooking the street, the place where he probably sat to watch the world go by. A plaid blanket was carefully folded over the back. Framed photographs decorated every available surface. Nori approached one of them, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the silver frame. It was Walter, much younger, with a radiant smile she'd never seen in person. Beside him, a beautiful woman with dark hair and kind eyes. And a boy, no more than 5 years old, clinging to Walter's leg, laughing at the camera with childlike abandon. That's my grandmother, Eleanor. Nori almost dropped the frame. She spun around quickly, her heart racing in her chest, and there was Jack, standing in the living room entrance like an apparition she half expected and half feared to see. He wasn't wearing the corporate suit anymore. He had on dark jeans and a gray shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that looked accustomed to work, despite hands that suggested more typing than physical labor. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd run his fingers through it repeatedly. There was a vulnerability in him now that hadn't been present at the diner, something raw and exposed that made him seem more human, and consequently, more dangerous to Nori's fragile equilibrium. "Sorry," he said quickly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I should have knocked. I just came to get some documents that were left in the office. Didn't think you'd come so soon." "It's my house now," Nori responded, and the statement sounded strange coming from her mouth, as if she was trying out words in a foreign language. "Apparently." Jack made a grimace that could have been a smile or an expression of pain. "Yes, apparently." The silence that settled between them wasn't comfortable like the ones she'd shared with Walter. It was loaded, tense, full of unspoken things that hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Nori carefully placed the frame back in its spot and turned to face him completely. "You're angry," she stated, not as a question, but as an observed fact. Jack ran his hand over his face, the stubble making a rough sound against his palm. "No, I'm not angry at you. But you're angry. At myself." The words came out in a heavy sigh, loaded with such palpable regret that Nori almost could touch it. "I didn't make it to his funeral in time. I was stuck in a meeting in Seattle. A meeting about profit margins and quarterly projections, things that seemed crucial at the time and now are completely insignificant." He walked to the window, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense under the shirt fabric. The afternoon light painted his profile in golden tones and shadows, revealing the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his nose, the way his lips pressed into a thin line of restraint. "When was the last time you saw him?" Nori asked softly, moving to stand beside him, maintaining a respectful distance but aware of the heat emanating from that large body. 3 years ago. Christmas." Jack laughed bitterly. "I said I'd come visit him in the summer. And in the fall. And the next Christmas. Always had an excuse. Always had something more urgent. And now?" His voice failed, breaking on the last word. Nori felt something move in her chest. An involuntary compassion for this man who carried guilt like a coat too heavy for the season. He knew. Jack turned to her then, his blue eyes so similar to Walter's but so different in the intensity of emotion they carried. "Knew what?" "That you were busy. That you had your life. He never spoke badly of you." Nori held his gaze, even as she felt her pulse quicken under that fixed attention. "He just missed you. But not with anger. With love." Something changed in Jack's expression, a subtle softening around the eyes, a vulnerability that made him look younger, more lost. "How do you know that?" "By the way he talked about you. Few words, but always with pride. Always with hope that you'd show up. And I never did." His voice was just a hoarse whisper now. "But you're here now." Jack took a step closer, reducing the space between them so that Nori could smell him. Something clean and woody mixed with coffee, and a hint of expensive cologne that probably cost more than she made in a week. The proximity made her aware of every breath, of every beat of her own heart. "I don't understand," Jack said, his voice low and intense. Why did he leave all this to a stranger, and not to family? The word stranger hurt more than Nori expected. But she maintained her composure. Maybe because I wasn't a stranger to him. Maybe because presence matters more than blood sometimes. Jack's eyes searched her face, as if looking for answers in her features, in the shape of her almond eyes, in the delicate curve of her lips, in the quiet determination of her chin. "You're right. And that makes me angry at myself, and curious about you at the same time." "There's nothing interesting about me," Nori replied, but her voice came out more breathless than she intended. "I doubt that. Jack tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously too seen and not enough. My grandfather was the best judge of character I knew. If he saw something in you worthy of all this, then there's definitely something interesting. Nori took a step back, needing distance before she did something stupid, like let herself be too affected by those impossible blue eyes and that deep voice that seemed to vibrate in her bones. I can't keep this. You don't have a choice. Jack repeated the same words from the meeting at the diner, but now they sounded different, less like a legal fact and more like a personal challenge. There's always a choice. So you choose to ignore his last wish? Choose to say he was wrong about you? The provocation in Jack's voice was soft but effective. Nori bit her lower lip, feeling frustration grow in her chest. You don't play fair. Never have. For the first time, a genuine smile touched his lips. Small, crooked, but real, and devastatingly attractive. But I'm trying to learn. They stood there, two strangers connected by a man they'd both loved in different ways, in a suspended moment where past and future collided in the present. The air between them vibrated with unexplored possibilities, with unnamed tensions, with something dangerous and inevitable beginning to form. I need time, Nori finally said, breaking the spell. As much time as you need. Jack nodded but didn't move, as if his feet were glued to that wooden floor. But Nori? Yes? Thank you. For being good to him when no one else in the family was there to be. And with those words, Jack left the room, his footsteps echoing through the empty house until the front door closed softly, leaving Nori alone with her confused thoughts, a racing heart, and the unsettling feeling that her life had just become infinitely more complicated. 2 weeks passed at a strange, uneven pace. Nori kept working at the diner during the day, but her nights now belonged to the house on Maple Street. She cleaned, organized, discovered small treasures hidden in drawers, old letters, yellowed photographs, a stamp collection that Walter apparently kept. Each object was a window into a man she realized she'd only known superficially, and that both saddened and enchanted her at the same time. Jack hadn't shown up since that first encounter in the living room, and Nori was certain, or almost certain, that she wasn't disappointed about it. She was too busy to think about those impossible blue eyes, or the way his presence had made the air feel denser, more charged. Too busy to remember the deep timbre of his voice or the way he'd looked at her like he was trying to decipher a complex code, until he showed up again. It was a Thursday morning, the diner still quiet before the breakfast rush. Nori was wiping down the counter when she heard the doorbell. She looked up automatically with her professional smile already on her lips, and the words of welcome died in her throat. Jack stood in the doorway wearing worn jeans and a brown leather jacket over a simple white t-shirt. He looked less executive now, more accessible, but no less striking. His hair was damp as if he'd just gotten out of the shower, and there was a hesitation in his posture she hadn't seen before. "Hi," he said, and the simplicity of that greeting somehow completely disarmed her. "Hi." Nori wiped her hands on her apron, feeling her heart do that strange thing where it speeds up without permission. What are you doing here?" Jack approached the counter, choosing the same stool where Walter used to sit. The coincidence, or perhaps the intention, didn't go unnoticed by Nori. "Thought I'd get some coffee." "Coffee?" She repeated the word as if it were new, strange. "It's a diner, right? You serve coffee." There was a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, something between nervousness and amusement. Nori grabbed a cup, not Walter's, she couldn't do that yet, and filled it with the fresh coffee she'd just brewed. "How do you take it?" Jack was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the cup, then on her, then back on the cup. Black, 2 spoons of sugar, no cream. The air left Nori's lungs all at once. Like him, Jack confirmed, and there was something vulnerable in his expression now, something raw that made her chest tighten painfully. She prepared the coffee exactly as Walter liked it, watching the sugar crystals dissolve on the dark surface. When she placed the cup in front of Jack, their fingers brushed briefly, an accidental touch that sent a wave of heat up her arm. She pulled away too quickly, almost knocking over the thermal carafe in the process. Jack took a long sip, his eyes closing for a moment. When he opened them again, there was something shining there that looked dangerously close to unshed tears. It's exactly how I remembered. You used to drink coffee with him? When I was a kid, every Saturday morning. His voice became distant, lost in memories Nori couldn't see but could almost feel. He let me add the sugar. Always 2 spoons. No more, no less. Said balance was important in everything in life. Nori leaned her elbows on the counter, allowing herself to get closer than professionalism would normally require. He seemed wise. He was, is, always will be, I guess. Jack turned the cup between his hands, watching the dark liquid as if it contained answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. I messed everything up, Nori. Let work consume my life. Forgot what really mattered. And now it's too late to fix. It's not too late to honor his memory. Jack's eyes met hers, and the intensity there made her tremble. That's why I came. Not just for the coffee. Then why? The house. He took a deep breath, like someone preparing to dive into deep water. The heater's broken. I noticed when I was there last week getting the last of the documents. It's getting cold now, and you're going to need heat. Nori had noticed. She'd spent the last 3 nights wrapped in blankets, postponing the inevitable need to call a technician she probably couldn't afford. I'll take care of it. Let me help. It wasn't a request. It wasn't exactly a demand either. It was something in between. An offer loaded with meaning that went beyond home repairs. Jack, I need to. The interruption was gentle but firm. I need to do something. Need to be present. Even if it's late. Even if it's just to fix a broken heater in the house that should have been mine, but that he wisely gave to someone who truly deserved it. There was no bitterness in his words. Just a raw honesty that unsettled something inside Nori. She studied his face, the tense line of his jaw, the subtle weariness around his eyes, the way he held the coffee cup like it was an anchor. Do you know how to fix heaters? She finally asked, and a small smile touched her lips. Jack laughed. A low, rich sound that reverberated pleasantly in Nori's chest. Absolutely not. But I've got YouTube and irrational determination. That's a dangerous combination. The Caldwell family specialty. And so, against her better judgment, Nori found herself agreeing. They set it up for that same evening after she finished her shift. Jack insisted on paying for the coffee, leaving a tip that was too generous and that she tried to refuse, but he'd already left through the door before she could protest. When Nori got home at 7 that evening, Jack was already there, sitting on the porch steps with a toolbox beside him and his phone in his hand, clearly watching some tutorial. He looked up when she approached, and the smile that lit up his face was so genuine, so unpretentious, that something moved dangerously in her chest. Ready for an adventure in amateur home repairs? He asked, standing up with fluid movements. As ready as I'm going to be. They worked side by side in the basement for 2 hours. The heater was an old, temperamental relic that required more patience than technical skill. Jack read the online instructions while Nori held the flashlight, their voices echoing in the confined space. He smelled like soap and something woody, and every time he leaned closer to see better, Nori became hyper-aware of the proximity, of the warmth of his skin, the way muscles moved under his shirt when he reached for a tool. Pass me that wrench, Jack asked, his voice focused. Nori searched in the toolbox, her fingers finding the cold metal. When she handed him the tool, their hands touched again, more than an accidental brush this time. Jack didn't pull away immediately. Neither did she. They stayed like that for a second, maybe 2, their eyes meeting in the dim flashlight glow. Sorry, Jack murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. It's okay, Nori replied, and realized she was being truthful. Eventually, after many frustrated attempts, creative curses from Jack and uncontrollable laughter from Nori when he hit his head on the pipe for the 3rd time, they managed to get the heater working. The familiar roar of the machine coming to life was met with a celebration that included Jack lifting Nori off the ground in a spontaneous, excited hug. When he set her back down, keeping his hands on her waist for a moment longer than necessary, they both went very quiet. The joy of victory faded into something different, something more intense, more dangerous. Nori, Jack began, his voice hoarse. We should clean up this mess, she interrupted quickly, pulling away before her heart could make decisions her head wasn't ready to accept yet. They cleaned in silence, but it was no longer the comfortable silence she'd shared with Walter. It was charged, tense, full of promises unmade and desires unacknowledged. When they finished and went up to the kitchen, Jack washed his hands at the sink while Nori made fresh coffee. 2 spoons of sugar, no cream. They sat at the kitchen table, steaming cups between them, and for the first time since they'd met, they talked, really talked, about work, about abandoned dreams, about regrets that weighed on their shoulders like stones. Jack spoke about the pressure of living up to corporate expectations, about how he'd forgotten who he was in the race to become who he thought he should be. Nori shared about her own loneliness, about how she'd learned to become invisible to survive, about the constant fear of not being enough. And somewhere between the confessions and the cooling coffee, something changed. A bridge was built, a connection was made. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something that could become love if they let it. When Jack finally left, it was past midnight. At the door, he hesitated, turning to face her one last time. "Can I come back? To help with other things that need fixing?" Nori knew he wasn't just talking about the house. "Yes, you can come back." And as she watched his car disappear into the night, Nori touched her lips softly, wondering when exactly she'd stopped seeing Jack Caldwell as Walter's absent grandson and started seeing him as just Jack, an imperfect, lost man trying to find his way back home. The following days established a rhythm Nori never would have predicted. Jack started showing up regularly, not every day, but often enough that his presence stopped being a surprise and became something she, secretly, began to look forward to. He brought tools, downloaded tutorials, a stubborn determination to fix every crack and problem the old house presented. And always, he started with coffee at the diner at 7:13 in the morning. It was a sunny Saturday when everything changed again. Nori was at the house, sitting on the living room floor surrounded by boxes of Walter's belongings she still needed to organize, when she found a worn leather notebook. The pages were filled with the elegant handwriting she'd recognize anywhere, but they weren't letters or personal notes. They were plans, rough architectural blueprints, lists of needs, carefully calculated budgets. And at the top of the first page, in capital letters and underlined, "Community Center, a place where no one is invisible." Nori's hands trembled as she turned the pages. Walter had planned everything, transforming his house into a space for neighborhood seniors, a place where they could gather, talk, play cards, simply exist without the loneliness that consumed so many. There were even notes about how Nori would be perfect to run the place, about how she had the rare gift of making people feel seen. She didn't realize she was crying until she felt tears falling on the yellowed paper. "Nori?" She looked up quickly. Jack stood in the living room entrance, an expression of immediate concern transforming his features. He crossed the space in 3 long strides, kneeling beside her without hesitation. "What happened? Are you okay?" His hands hovered near her as if he wanted to touch her but wasn't sure if he had permission. Without words, Nori held out the notebook. Jack took it, his eyes scanning the pages with growing intensity. She watched his face change, initial surprise giving way to something deeper, more moved. When he finally looked at her again, there was admiration there, mixed with that familiar pain of regret. He wanted this, Jack said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. Wanted to transform the house into something meaningful. "He wanted me to do this," Nori corrected, wiping tears with the back of her hand. "But I don't know if I can. I don't have money or experience with this kind of thing. It's a beautiful dream, but that's all it is. A dream." Jack closed the notebook carefully, his fingers tracing the worn cover with reverence. Then he turned completely toward her, his knees lightly touching hers on the floor, creating an intimate circle of closeness. What if it didn't have to be just a dream? "Jack, listen." He leaned forward, the intensity in his blue eyes holding her in place. "I have resources, I have connections. I can help make this real." Nori shook her head, the instinct to refuse help rising automatically. "I can't accept your money. I've already accepted too much. It's not my money. It's Walter's. The money he left me." Jack ran his hand through his hair, messing it up in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "He left me a generous amount, Nori. Money I don't need, that I don't deserve. But this? Making his final dream come true? This gives meaning to everything. Nori's heart beat irregularly. Why? Why do you care so much? The question hung suspended in the air between them. Jack took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with an honesty that touched her deeply. Because I spent 3 years ignoring a man who loved me unconditionally. Because I chose spreadsheets and meetings instead of morning coffees and meaningful conversations. Because when he died, I realized I'd wasted something precious that I could never get back. He moved closer, so close now that Nori could see the tiny flecks of darker color in his blue eyes, could feel the heat emanating from that large body. But this, helping you realize his dream, this gives me a chance to honor him, to do something that matters, to maybe finally do the right thing. Nori was speechless. There was so much sincerity in his face, so much need for redemption, that she felt something inside her give way. You don't need to redeem yourself, Jack. He loved you. Even when you weren't there, he loved you. I know. And that somehow makes it all worse. He smiled sadly. So let me do this. Not out of guilt, but because it's the right thing. Because the world needs more places where people don't feel invisible. Because you deserve to see this dream come true. Nori bit her lip. Internal conflict waging a silent battle. Independence had been her armor for so long. Accepting help seemed dangerous, like opening a door she might not be able to close later. But then she thought of Walter, thought of his quiet kindness, the way he'd never judged, never pushed, just offered constant presence. And she thought of how many other Walters existed in the world, lonely people needing a place to belong. We'd have to do it right, she finally said, her voice hesitant but growing in certainty with each word. It wouldn't just be a space, it would be a home. With coffee always fresh, comfortable chairs, maybe a library, board games, a garden where we could plant things together. Jack's face lit up in a way that completely transformed his features. The smile that emerged was genuine, radiant, making his eyes shine with an excitement Nori hadn't seen before. Yes, exactly that. And it wouldn't be charity, Nori continued, warming to the idea now that she'd started articulating it. It would be community. People would contribute however they could, with time, with skills, with stories. No one would be a project. Everyone would be part of something. Perfect. Jack took her hands before he could think better of it, intertwining his fingers with hers in a way that sent electric currents up her arms. When do we start? The sudden proximity, the unexpected touch, the intensity of the moment. Everything conspired to steal the air from Nori's lungs. She looked at their intertwined hands, noticing how his were large and calloused in ways that betrayed recent work, how the fingers fit in the spaces between hers as if they'd been made for it. Jack, she whispered, uncertain if it was a warning or an invitation. He seemed to realize what he'd done but didn't release her hands. Instead, his thumb began tracing slow, deliberate circles on the back of her hand, a gesture so intimate it made Nori's heart race. Sorry. I just get excited sometimes. Don't apologize. The words came out softer than she intended. They stayed like that, kneeling on Walter's living room floor, surrounded by boxes of memories and plans for the future, hands intertwined and gazes locked on each other. For a moment that could have lasted seconds or hours, the air between them vibrated with possibility, with the weight of something still unnamed but growing with impossible to ignore urgency. It was Jack who eventually broke the spell, releasing her hands with visible reluctance. We should make a list of what we need, who we can contact, how to start. Nori nodded, grateful for the practicality, even as she felt a pang of disappointment at the distance. Yes, a list. They spent the next 3 hours planning. Jack was surprisingly organized when he took off the executive mode and simply allowed himself to be passionate about something. He called contacts, researched regulations, made detailed notes with surprisingly elegant handwriting. Nori contributed ideas about programming, about how to make the space welcoming, about small details that would make a difference. And somewhere between the lists and phone calls and plans growing in complexity, something happened. They began to work as a team, not as strangers collaborating, but as partners who understood each other intuitively. Jack anticipated her concerns before she verbalized them. She completed his sentences naturally. There was a synchronicity emerging between them that was both frightening and exciting. When the sun began to set, painting the room in golden and orange tones, Jack stood up to leave. At the door, he hesitated, turning to face her with an expression that made Nori's stomach flip. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For letting me be part of this. For giving me a chance to honor my grandfather in a way that matters." He paused, seeming to struggle with words he wanted to say but wasn't sure he should. "And for being you. For making this seem possible when it could easily seem impossible." Nori felt heat rise up her neck. "You make it possible too, Jack." He smiled. That small, crooked smile that was beginning to do dangerous things to her heart. "Partners, then?" "Partners," she agreed, extending her hand formally. Jack looked at the extended hand, then at her, and then did something unexpected. Instead of shaking her hand, he pulled her into a hug. Quick but tight. His arms wrapping around her completely for a moment, that lasted only a few heartbeats but seemed to etch itself permanently into her memory. She felt the solidity of him, the warmth, the woody smell of his skin, the way he held her as if she were something precious. When they separated, both were breathing a little faster, a little more shallowly. Jack cleared his throat, the tips of his ears discreetly red. "Good night, Nori." "Good night, Jack." And as she watched him disappear through that door for the second time, Nori touched the place where his arms had been around her and realized, with a mixture of terror and anticipation, that she was beginning to not be able to imagine him not being part of her life. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity and transformation. The house on Maple Street began to gain new life. Walls were painted in warm, welcoming tones. Old furniture was restored. Spaces were reorganized to maximize comfort and connection. Jack showed up almost every day now, sometimes early in the morning before work, sometimes at night after Nori finished her shift at the diner. He brought tools, materials, ideas, and that stubborn determination she was beginning to recognize as a fundamental characteristic of his. But it wasn't just the house that was changing. It was the dynamic between them. Nori began to notice small things about Jack that had gone unnoticed before, like how he always organized the silverware in the right order when helping set up the community kitchen space. Knives, forks, spoons, exactly as she herself did. How he tilted his head slightly to the left when he was focused on a problem, his forehead creasing in adorable concentration. How his laughter came accompanied by a subtle tremor in his shoulders, starting low in his chest and growing until it lit up his entire face. She learned that he was afraid of spiders but would never admit it out loud, that he loved old noir films but pretended it was just film appreciation, that he hummed unconsciously when he was in a good mood. Always 80s songs he swore he didn't know as well as he clearly did. And Jack, in turn, was learning about her. "You always do this," he said on a Tuesday afternoon, watching her rearrange the books on the shelf for the third time. Nori looked over her shoulder, a dusty poetry volume in her hands. "Do what?" "Arrange things by color before deciding it should be by size, and then change again to alphabetical order." There was amusement in his voice, but also something softer. Affection, perhaps. "It's like watching someone try to organize the chaos of the universe one book at a time." She felt heat rise up her neck. "It's a stupid habit." "It's not stupid." Jack moved closer, picking up a book from a nearby pile and handing it to her. Their fingers touched in the transfer, and neither pulled away as quickly as they should have. "It's meticulous, careful, like everything you do." Nori's heart beat irregularly. "You watch me arrange books? I watch you do a lot of things." The confession came out low, almost a whisper, and there was something in his blue eyes that made her forget how to breathe properly. "I can't help it." The moment stretched, charged and tense until Nori broke eye contact and returned her attention to the shelf, her fingers trembling slightly as she slid the book into place. "We should finish before it gets dark." "Yes," Jack agreed, but his voice carried a note of disappointment. "We should." It was on a Thursday that everything changed again. They were in the kitchen, painting the walls a soft butter yellow that Nori had chosen because it looks like sunshine even on cloudy days. Jack was at the top of a ladder, reaching the upper corner near the ceiling, while Nori worked on the lower part of the opposite wall. Have you thought about what you're going to do when all this is ready? Jack asked, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. What do you mean? With your life? Are you going to quit the diner? Run this place full time? Nori dipped the roller in the paint tray, considering the question. I don't know. The diner has always been my constant, you know? The place where I know exactly who I am and what to do. This, she gestured vaguely at the space around them. This is new. Scary, but exciting? Jack climbed down a few steps on the ladder, turning to look at her directly. Yes, she admitted, meeting his eyes. Exciting too. You're incredible. You know that? The words came out spontaneously, unfiltered. And Jack looked as surprised as she was that he'd said them out loud. The way you're embracing all this, turning his dream into reality even though you're scared. It's inspiring. Nori laughed nervously, returning her attention to the wall. I'm not incredible. I'm just trying not to mess everything up. You couldn't mess this up if you tried. Jack climbed down completely from the ladder, setting his brush aside. He crossed the kitchen, stopping a few steps from her, close enough that she could feel the heat emanating from that large body. Nori, look at me. She obeyed slowly, raising her eyes to meet his. The intensity there hit her like a wave. Desire, admiration, something bigger and more frightening that she wasn't ready to name. You have a rare talent, Jack said, his voice low and hoarse. For making people feel seen, valued, like they matter. You do it without thinking, without effort. It's just who you are. And it's devastating. Jack, she didn't know what she was trying to say. Didn't know if it was a warning or an invitation, or simply his name escaping from lips that had forgotten how to form other words. He took another step, reducing the space between them to mere inches. I know this is complicated. I know we started this strange way because of my grandfather. I know I should probably keep my distance, be professional about all this. But, Nori whispered, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. But I can't stop thinking about you. The confession came out raw, honest, vulnerable in a way that completely disarmed her. I wake up thinking about how you smile when you think no one's watching. I spend all day looking for excuses to come here. I go to sleep wondering what you're doing, if you're okay, if you think about me even half as much as I think about you. Nori's hands gripped the paint roller handle hard enough to whiten her knuckles. We shouldn't. I know. Jack raised his hand slowly, telegraphing the intention, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. When she didn't move, his fingers touched her face with a gentleness that contrasted with his size and strength. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, wiping away a paint smudge she didn't even know was there. But sometimes the most important things are the ones we shouldn't want. Nori closed her eyes, allowing herself for a moment to just feel. His touch, warm and firm against her skin. The woody smell she now completely associated with safety and excitement in equal measures. The proximity that made every nerve ending in her body light up on alert. I'm scared, she admitted in a low voice, opening her eyes to find him watching her with a tenderness that made her tremble. Of what? That this is too intense, too fast. That you'll realize I'm not as special as you think. That I'll mess this up like I've messed up other things before. The insecurities poured out like a broken dam. That you'll leave when you realize who I really am. Jack held her face with both hands now, gently forcing her to maintain eye contact. Nori Chen. I already know who you are. I've seen you be kind to strangers who didn't deserve kindness. I've seen you work yourself to exhaustion because you care too much to do anything halfway. I've seen you cry over the words of a dead man because your heart is too big to fit just in your chest. He leaned closer, their foreheads almost touching. And if you think any of that would make me want you less, then you clearly need to get to know me better, because Nori, you're exactly as special as I think, possibly more. A tear escaped, sliding down her cheek. Jack wiped it away with his thumb, the gesture so tender it broke something inside her and simultaneously began to heal cracks she didn't even know existed. I think about you too, she whispered, the confession costing everything but worth it for the way his face lit up. All the time, too much, in ways that scare me. You don't need to be scared. His voice was a deep promise. Not of me. Never of me. They stayed like that, foreheads almost touching, breaths mingling in the tiny space between them. his hands framing her face as if it were something precious and fragile, while the world kept spinning outside, oblivious to the fact that something fundamental was changing in that half-painted kitchen. It was Nori who eventually broke the moment, pulling back with reluctance. "We should finish painting." Jack let his hands fall, but the smile that curved his lips was knowing, patient. "We should." They returned to work, but something had changed irrevocably. Glances now lasted longer. Accidental touches seemed less accidental and more intentional. Silences were loaded with promises unmade but understood, and when Jack left that night, he paused at the door and turned around. "Nori?" "Yes?" "I'll wait. However long you need to trust this, trust me, trust us, I'll wait." He left before she could respond, leaving her alone with a racing heart, trembling hands, and the frightening and exciting certainty that she was falling, fast, intense, and completely, for Jack Caldwell. And for the first time in a long time, Nori didn't want to hold back. The house was almost ready. 3 months of hard work had transformed Walter's quiet home into something alive, pulsing, ready to embrace the community that so desperately needed it. The walls carried new colors. The floors gleamed with fresh wax. Each room breathed possibility. But there was one last space that still needed attention. The library on the second floor, where empty shelves waited for books and bare walls begged for paint. It was a Friday night, rain tapping softly against the windows when Nori and Jack decided to tackle that final project. They'd been working in comfortable silence for the past 2 hours, old jazz music playing softly on the radio Jack had restored, a relic from the 50s that had belonged to Walter, and now worked perfectly after hours of patient work. "Pass me that tray," Nori asked, balanced precariously on a ladder while trying to reach the upper corner of the wall. Jack grabbed the paint tray, but instead of simply handing it over, he moved closer to the ladder, positioning himself right below her. "You're too high up, come down. I'm almost done with this section." "Nori." There was something in his voice, concern mixed with something deeper, more protective. "Come down. I'll do it." She looked down and met those blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her momentarily forget why she was on a ladder. The angle offered a different perspective of him. The strong line of his jaw, the curve of lips she'd spent too much time imagining against hers, the way those large hands gripped the ladder with possessive firmness. "I can do it," she insisted, but her voice came out less firm than intended. "I know you can." Jack smiled, that small smile that always did dangerous things to her heart rate. "But let me help anyway." There was something in the way he said it, in the low, warm tone of his voice, that made Nori realize they weren't just talking about painting anymore. She descended slowly, aware of his eyes following every movement, of the growing proximity with each step. When her feet touched the ground, she was so close to him she could feel the heat emanating from that body, could see the tiny golden flecks in his blue eyes, could count every beat of her own irregular heartbeat. "Thank you," she murmured. Jack didn't move away. His fingers still gripped the ladder on one side, effectively creating a barrier that kept her between the cold metal and his warm body. "You have paint on your face." "I do?" Nori raised her hand to wipe it, but Jack gently intercepted it. "Let me." His fingers touched her chin, tilting her face slightly upward. With his thumb, he wiped a paint smudge from her cheekbone, the touch lingering longer than necessary, transforming into a deliberate caress. "Here too," he whispered, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, sliding down her neck in a path that made every nerve in Nori's body light up. "Jack," his name came out breathless, more plea than protest. "Tell me to stop." His eyes searched hers, vulnerable and intense at the same time. "If you don't want this, tell me to stop and I'll stop. Immediately." Nori should have been sensible, cautious, protect herself as she always had. But when she opened her mouth, the words that came out were, "Don't stop." Something changed in Jack's face, the careful restraint melting into something more primal, more honest. His hand slid from her neck to her nape, fingers tangling in her hair as he leaned closer. "I've been thinking about doing this for weeks." Doing what? She knew, but she needed to hear him say it. This. And then his mouth was on hers, The kiss started soft, almost reverent, lips moving gently against hers as if he was memorizing the shape, the taste, the feeling. But when Nori sighed against his mouth, when her hands came up to grip the front of his shirt, something broke. The kiss deepened, became urgent, years of loneliness and weeks of contained tension exploding into pure need. Nori's back found the wall. She didn't know if he'd pushed her or if she'd stepped back, but it didn't matter because Jack was pressed against her, one hand still in her hair, the other on her waist, holding her as if she were something precious and wild at the same time. She could feel the solidity of him, every muscle tense beneath his clothes, his heart beating as fast as hers. When they finally separated to breathe, both were panting. Jack rested his forehead against hers, eyes still closed as if trying to compose himself. That was... He didn't finish the sentence. Yes, Nori agreed, because there were no adequate words for what that had been. Jack opened his eyes, and what she saw there, raw desire mixed with tenderness, need tempered with patience, made her tremble. I want you, Nori, in every way, but I need you to be sure. I'm sure. And she was. For the first time in a long time, she was absolutely certain about something. He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring. His hands explored, fingers tracing the curve of her waist, rising up her ribs, memorizing every contour through the thin fabric of her blouse. When he reached the first button, he hesitated, his eyes seeking hers in silent question. Nori responded by bringing her own hands to the button, undoing it slowly, then the second, the third, until the blouse was open, revealing warmed skin and raw vulnerability. Jack watched every movement with an intensity that bordered on reverence, as if witnessing something sacred. You're beautiful, he murmured, his fingers tracing her collarbone, sliding down her sternum in a touch so light it could have been imagination, but sent waves of heat through her entire body. So beautiful that sometimes I forget to breathe when I look at you. Nori pulled at his shirt and Jack helped, removing it in one fluid motion that revealed defined muscles, tanned skin, some scars that told stories she wanted to know. Her hands explored his chest with admiration, feeling the warmth, the solidity, the way he trembled under her touch. They moved together toward the old sofa that still occupied the library, the same one where Walter used to read. It should have felt strange, but instead it felt right, as if they were honoring his memory by creating something new and alive in that space. Jack laid her down gently, following right after, his weight pressing her against the worn cushions in a way that was both anchoring and liberating. He kissed her neck, her shoulders, each new territory explored with meticulous attention, as if learning a new language through touch. Tell me to go slow, he whispered against her skin, his voice hoarse with restraint. Tell me if it's too much, if you need a break, if... Nori silenced him with a kiss, deep and unreserved, communicating wordlessly that he didn't need to be so careful, that she wasn't as fragile as he feared. But Jack, being Jack, kept the pace deliberately slow, transforming each touch into poetry, each kiss into promise. The remaining clothes disappeared gradually, removed by hands that trembled slightly with contained desire but were never rushed. Jack explored each newly revealed part with almost religious dedication, lips tracing paths that made Nori arch against him, hands memorizing curves and angles, murmuring low words of admiration that made her feel simultaneously vulnerable and powerful. When they finally joined, it was with open eyes, gazes locked on each other, silently communicating things they didn't yet have the courage to say out loud. The movement began slow, almost cautious, both adjusting to the newness, to the intensity of being so completely connected. Nori. Jack whispered her name like a prayer, like a promise, like something sacred. She responded by arching against him, hands sliding down his broad back, feeling muscles contract beneath skin, feeling every breath, every heartbeat synchronizing with hers. The rhythm increased gradually, building in intensity until the world reduced to just that, to the heat between them, to the way they fit together perfectly, to the growing sensation that they were on the edge of something transformative. When release came, it was together. Waves of pleasure and emotion so intense that for a moment Nori couldn't distinguish where she ended, and he began. Jack buried his face in her neck, whispering incoherent words against her skin, as they trembled together, holding each other like anchors in a storm of sensations. After, when breathing calmed and reality began to gradually return, they remained entwined on the narrow sofa, bodies still connected, reluctant to break contact. Jack rolled slightly to the side to not crush her, but kept his arms firmly around her as if he feared she might disappear if he let go. The rain continued tapping softly on the windows. The radio still played jazz quietly, a female voice singing about love found in unlikely places. The paint still waited in the trays, the walls were still half done, but none of that mattered in that moment. Jack kissed her forehead, then the tip of her nose, finally her lips. Soft, slow kisses that were more about connection than desire. "Stay with me," he murmured against her mouth. "Here. Now. Always." Nori smiled against his chest, tears appearing without warning, but not from sadness, when from relief, from joy, from something so big it didn't fit inside her. Always is a long time. It's not long enough. He tightened his arms around her, his face buried in her hair. "Not when it comes to you." They stayed like that until their bodies cooled, until the discomfort of the narrow sofa became impossible to ignore. Jack eventually got up, looking for the scattered clothes, but not before kissing her one more time. Long, deep, full of promises they finally had permission to make. When they dressed and returned to painting, there was a different lightness between them. Glances were bolder, touches more frequent and deliberate. Jack couldn't pass by her without at least brushing her hand. Nori couldn't resist leaning against him when they were close. And when they finally finished that last wall and stood together admiring the work, hands firmly intertwined, they both knew they'd crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Not that they wanted to return. The following 2 weeks were a kind of happiness Nori had never experienced before. Jack practically lived at the house now, his toothbrush sharing space in the bathroom, his jacket hanging on the entrance hook, his presence permeating every room as if he'd always belonged there. They woke up tangled together, made coffee together with a domestic synchronicity that seemed impossible for something so new, worked side by side, transforming Walter's dream into tangible reality. The community center was almost ready for its grand opening. Neighbors had started showing up, curious about the changes, offering help, bringing donations. Mrs. Patterson from number 380 donated an antique dining table. Mr. Kim offered to teach Tai Chi in the mornings. Margaret from the diner brought her collection of vintage magazines. The community was embracing the project in a way that warmed Nori's heart and validated every hour of hard work. But there was something happening behind the scenes that Nori didn't know about. Something that Jack, in his desperate need to make things work perfectly, had kept hidden. It was on a Tuesday afternoon when everything fell apart. Nori was organizing the last shipment of donated books when her phone rang. An unknown number she almost ignored. But something made her answer. "Hello? Miss Chen, this is David Morrison from the County Community Development Foundation. We're calling about your application for the Community Spaces Grant." Nori frowned, the book in her hands forgotten. "I'm sorry, but I didn't submit any application." There was a confused pause on the other end. "Really? Because we have a complete application here in your name, submitted 3 weeks ago, requesting $50,000 in funding for the Walter Caldwell Community Center. The application was approved. We're ready to process the disbursement." Nori's blood froze in her veins. "Who submitted this application?" Jack Caldwell. He's listed as co-director of the project. We assumed he had your authorization." The man's following words turned into white noise. Nori thanked him mechanically, hung up, and stood in the middle of the newly painted library, trying to process the betrayal burning in her chest like acid. Jack had gone behind her back, had made decisions about their project, her project, without consultation, without permission, without even mentioning it, had treated it like just another of his corporate deals where he simply did what he thought best and expected gratitude afterward. The front door opened, and she heard the familiar voice calling, "Nori? I brought lunch." She descended the stairs slowly, each step feeding the growing anger in her chest. Jack was in the kitchen smiling as he unpacked Thai food containers. Her favorite because of course he knew, because he paid attention to everything about her, except apparently the most important thing, her autonomy. "Hi, love." He turned, the smile disappearing immediately when he saw the expression on her face. What happened? $50,000. The words came out ice cold, controlled. You applied for a $50,000 grant. In my name. Without telling me. Jack visibly paled. Nori, I can explain. Explain then. She crossed her arms, the posture defensive but necessary to keep standing when every part of her wanted to crumble. Explain why you thought it was appropriate to make decisions about my project without my permission. Explain why you treated me like a child incapable of handling her own affairs. It wasn't like that. Jack took a step toward her, hands extended in a gesture of appeasement. I was just trying to help. Costs were rising. And I knew you were worried about money, so when I saw the opportunity for the grant, you should have told me. Nori's voice rose, years of contained frustration finally finding release. You should have come to me and said, Nori, I saw this opportunity, what do you think? But you didn't do that. You just decided, alone, what was best for me. Like, I'm your project. You're not my project. Jack ran his hand over his face, frustration evident in every tense line of his body. You're everything, Nori. I just wanted to make things easier for you. Making easier or controlling. She took a step back when he tried to approach again. Because from my perspective, it looks a lot like you doing what you always do. Taking control, fixing things, solving problems without consulting the people those problems actually affect. That's not fair. Isn't it? Nori laughed bitterly. Jack, you did exactly what you did with your grandfather. Got so busy with your plans and solutions that you forgot to actually ask what I wanted, what I needed. You replaced me with a version of me that only exists in your head. A version that needs to be saved, protected, managed. The accusation hit home. Nori saw the exact moment the words penetrated, the way Jack recoiled as if physically struck. I didn't mean to, but that's what you did. Tears burned in her eyes now, but Nori held them back through pure willpower. I'm not your redemption project, Jack. I'm not the way for you to fix your mistakes with Walter. I'm a person with my own voice, my own choices, and you took that from me. Nori, please. There was desperation in his voice now, raw and exposed. I messed up. I admit it. But let me fix it. Let you what? Fix it again? She shook her head, each following word costing everything. That's exactly the problem. You can't just fix this, you can't solve it with money or connections or grand gestures. You violated my trust. Jack fell silent, his shoulders dropping in defeat. When he spoke again, his voice was just a hoarse whisper. What do you want me to do? I want space. The words came out firmer than Nori felt. I need time to think, to figure out if I can trust you again. If this, she gestured between them, is real or just another problem you're trying to solve. It's real. The intensity in his eyes was almost unbearable. Nori, what I feel for you is the realest thing in my life. Then respect me enough to give me the space I'm asking for. The pain on Jack's face was palpable, but he nodded slowly. How long? I don't know. She turned, unable to keep looking at him without giving in, without forgiving before she was truly ready. But I need you to stop showing up here, stop showing up at the diner, just stop for now. She heard movement behind her. Jack gathering his jacket, his belongings scattered throughout the house. Heard his footsteps approaching, stopping right behind her. For one terrible and wonderful moment, she thought he might touch her, that he might break the rules she'd just established. I love you. The words were said so quietly she almost didn't hear them. I know I don't have the right to say this now. I know I ruined any chance I had of you believing me. But it's true, and I'll spend every day you give me proving it. Then he left, the door closing with a soft click that echoed through the now silent house like a gunshot. Nori collapsed on the kitchen floor, finally allowing the tears to fall. Tears of anger, of sadness, of confused love she didn't know how to process. The Thai food cooled on the counter. The project they'd built together waited in the next room, and the space where Jack had been for weeks felt painfully empty. She knew she'd done the right thing, knew she needed to maintain boundaries, demand respect, not allow love to make her accept less than she deserved. But knowing the right thing didn't make the pain any less sharp. The following weeks were a foggy blur of mechanical movement. Nori kept working on the community center, but alone now. Neighbors asked about Jack, and she smiled automatically, saying he was busy with work. Margaret from the diner looked at her with silent concern but knew better than to ask. The nights were the worst. The house seemed too big, too quiet without the sound of Jack humming 80s songs or the rustling of his notes. Nori found herself waking at 3 in the morning, reaching for the other side of the bed and finding only empty, cold space. She declined the grant, called the foundation, and politely explained there'd been a misunderstanding, that she couldn't accept the funds. It meant she'd have to work more, save more, maybe delay the opening. But it was important. It was hers. Jack respected her request, didn't show up, didn't call, didn't send messages. And Nori hated that part of her. A bigger part than she was comfortable admitting, was disappointed by that. She wanted him to fight harder, even knowing it would be hypocritical to demand space, and then be angry when he actually gave that space. It was in the third week, when Nori was painting the last railing on the front porch, that Margaret finally broke the silence. "He still comes to the diner, you know." The elderly woman sat on the steps watching Nori work. Every morning at 7:13, orders black coffee, 2 spoons of sugar, no cream, sits on the same stool, doesn't talk much, just drinks his coffee and stares out the window like he's waiting for something he knows won't come. Nori's brush slipped, leaving an irregular mark on the wood. "Margaret, I'm too old to beat around the bush, dear." Margaret adjusted the scarf on her neck, her wise eyes fixed on her. "That boy made a mistake. A big mistake. But he's learning. He's trying to understand where he went wrong, and he's respecting your boundaries even though he's clearly dying inside. He didn't consult me," Nori said. But the conviction in her voice had weakened. "No, he didn't. And you were right to be angry. To demand better." Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "But, dear, how many people in your life have actually cared enough to make mistakes trying to help? How many stayed after you pushed them away?" Tears burned in Nori's eyes. "I'm scared, Margaret. Scared that if I forgive too easily, he'll do it again. Scared that I'm just another project for him to fix." "Then talk to him." The woman's voice was gentle but firm. "Tell him exactly that. Put your cards on the table. But don't push him away because you're scared. Walter wouldn't have wanted that for you two." And with those words, Margaret stood up and left, leaving Nori alone with her thoughts and a decision she needed to make. Another week passed. 7 days that seemed to simultaneously drag like eternity and pass in the blink of an eye. Nori kept working on the community center, but each accomplishment felt hollow without someone to share it with. She'd finish organizing a shelf and turn automatically to comment something to Jack, only to find empty space. She'd make coffee and grab 2 cups before remembering she was alone. The grand opening was scheduled for 2 weeks from now. Invitations had been distributed, neighbors were excited, everything was ready. But Nori felt like she was preparing a party where half of her would be absent, where the most important guest had been deliberately excluded by her own hands. It was Harold who finally planted the seed of reconciliation. Harold Chen was an 82-year-old veteran who lived 3 houses down and who had become a constant presence at the center as soon as he heard about the project. He had endless stories from the Korean War, arthritic fingers that struggled with buttons but could still play chess with deadly precision, and a disturbing ability to read people like open books. "Your young Jack's been asking about me," Harold commented casually on a Thursday afternoon, moving his pawn on the chessboard they'd set up in the living room. Nori's hand froze over her own piece. "What?" "Last week, he approached me at the supermarket." Harold's eyes gleamed with knowledge. "Asked about my war stories. Said he wanted to collect narratives from neighborhood veterans, create some kind of oral archive. Offered to buy recording equipment, hire someone to transcribe." Nori's heart beat irregularly. "He did that?" "He did, but he was careful, you know." Harold moved his queen, capturing her bishop with casual efficiency. "Didn't mention your name. Didn't try to use it as an excuse to talk about you. Just was genuinely interested. Asked good questions, really listened." "Why are you telling me this?" Nori asked, though she already knew the answer. Harold smiled, that knowing smile that came from 8 decades of observing human behavior. "Because that boy loves you, dear, and he's learning. He's doing the work without expecting recognition, without trying to use it as bargaining chips. He's changing. How do you know? Because at the end of our conversation, he said something that stayed with me. Harold paused, his eyes meeting hers with intensity. He said, "Mr. Chen, I made the mistake of thinking that helping meant solving. I'm learning that sometimes helping just means being present and listening. Thank you for teaching me that today." Tears burned in Nori's eyes. She blinked quickly, trying to keep them away. He really said that? Word for word. Harold captured another of her pieces. She'd completely stopped paying attention to the game. Now, I'm just an old veteran who's seen a lot in this life. But if you ask me, I think it's worth at least talking to him. See if this growth is real. Nori stayed silent for a long moment. Internal conflict waging a silent war. Finally, she grabbed her phone and typed a message before she could convince herself otherwise. "Harold misses you." The response came in less than a minute. "I miss you too." Short. Simple. But loaded with meaning that made Nori's heart tighten painfully. She typed again, her fingers trembling slightly. "Can we talk? Tomorrow night? Whatever time you want. Wherever you want. At the house. 7 o'clock. I'll be there." Nori spent the next day in growing anxiety. Changed clothes 3 times, couldn't eat anything at lunch. Cleaned the house until it gleamed even though it was already spotless. At 6:50, she sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that was slowly cooling, trying to organize her thoughts into something coherent. At 7 o'clock sharp, because of course he'd be punctual, the doorbell rang. Nori opened the door and the impact of seeing him again hit her like a physical wave. Jack looked different. He'd lost weight, his facial angles sharper, dark shadows under his eyes suggesting poorly slept nights. But it was the expression that touched her most. Raw vulnerability, mixed with cautious hope, like someone approaching something precious they feared scaring away. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi." Nori stepped aside, letting him in. "Thanks for coming. Thank you for calling me." Jack entered slowly, hands in his pockets, clearly fighting the instinct to touch her. "The house looks beautiful. You did an incredible job." "We did." The correction came automatically. Something changed in his expression, gratitude mixed with pain. "We did." They sat at the kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee between them. Black coffee, 2 spoons of sugar, no cream. Nori had prepared it without thinking, the ritual so ingrained now that it seemed impossible to do differently. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but charged, both searching for the right words to begin. It was Jack who finally broke. "I messed up." "Yes, you did." Nori saw no point in softening it. "I've spent the past weeks trying to understand why. Why I thought it was acceptable to make that decision without you." He turned the cup between his hands, eyes fixed on the dark liquid. "And I realized something. I spent so much of my life being the guy who solves problems, who fixes things, that my entire identity was tied to that. When I couldn't fix something, I felt useless." "Jack, let me finish, please." He raised his eyes and the vulnerability there silenced her. "With you, I finally had something that truly mattered, and when I saw challenges arising, my immediate instinct was to solve them. Because in my twisted head, if I wasn't solving, fixing, making things easier, then what was my purpose? Why would you want me around?" The words hit Nori in the chest like arrows. "You really believed that?" "I did. I do. It's a work in progress." He smiled sadly. "But I'm learning. I'm in therapy now, twice a week. I'm working on understanding why I need to control everything, why I'm so afraid of being vulnerable without having a solution up my sleeve." Nori hadn't expected that. "You're in therapy?" "Started the week after you asked for space." Jack ran his hand over his face, the familiar gesture making her chest tighten. "Because you were right, Nori. About everything. I was doing to you what I did with my grandfather, assuming I knew better that my way of helping was the only way. I replaced real connection with grand gestures." "And now?" Nori asked softly. "What's changed?" "I'm learning to just be. To listen without already planning how to fix. To accept that sometimes people don't need solutions. They need presence." He paused, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "I talked to Harold, spent time with Margaret. met some of the other neighbors who were excited about the center, and just listened, without an agenda, without plans, just present. I heard. Nori allowed herself a small smile. The Veterans Oral Archive was a good idea. It was Harold's idea, not mine. I just offered resources to make it possible. Jack leaned forward, intensity returning to his eyes. And I didn't do anything without asking first. Didn't assume, didn't make decisions for him. Just asked, what do you need? How can I support this? And then I did what he asked. Nothing more, nothing less. Tears burned in Nori's eyes now. You're really changing. I'm trying. Because I want to be someone worthy of you. Someone who respects you enough to include you in every decision. Even the ones I think I know how to solve better. He extended his hand slowly across the table, not touching hers, but close enough to be an invitation. But I need you to know I'm not doing this to get you back, though I desperately want to get you back. I'm doing it because I realized I was living wrong, and you showed me that. Nori looked at his hand, so close but not assuming, not demanding. Waiting. Respecting. She thought about the last weeks of loneliness, the empty space he'd left, the way every accomplishment felt incomplete without him to share it with. She thought about Harold saying Jack was changing, about Margaret saying he showed up faithfully every morning, about all the small evidence that he hadn't given up even when she pushed him away. I'm learning too, she finally said, her own hand moving to meet his, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that made her heart race. Learning that asking for help isn't weakness, that accepting support doesn't make me dependent, that sometimes we need to let people love us their way even when it's clumsy. So where does that leave us? Jack asked, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. I don't know. Nori squeezed his fingers. But I know I missed you. Terribly. Every day. And I know what I feel for you didn't disappear just because you made a mistake. I love you. Jack said it again, like he'd said on that terrible day when he left. But this time there was something different. Not desperation, but calm certainty. And I'll spend every day proving to you that you can trust me. Not with grand gestures or elaborate solutions, but with presence, with listening, with respect for your choices even when I disagree. This might not be easy, Nori warned. We're going to argue. I'm going to get frustrated when you slip back into old patterns. You're going to get frustrated when I'm too stubborn to accept help even when I need it. I know. Jack smiled, genuine, hopeful, transformative. But it's worth it. You're worth every difficult argument, every uncomfortable moment of growth. Because on the other side of that, there's us. And us together can build something real. Nori stood up, still holding his hand, pulling him with her. Jack followed without questioning, allowing her to guide him. She led him to the library, the place where they'd surrendered to each other for the first time, where they'd discovered that what they felt was deeper than physical attraction. I love you too, she said, finally allowing herself to say the words she'd held back for weeks. And I'm willing to try again, but with clear rules this time, with honest communication, with you promising me you'll ask before assuming. I promise. Jack pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding her like something precious he'd almost lost and now fiercely protected. I'll ask. Always. About everything. They stayed like that for a long time, simply holding each other. Two imperfect people choosing to try again. Choosing to grow together instead of apart. The road ahead would still be difficult. There would be slip-ups and frustrations and moments of doubt. But as Nori allowed herself to melt into Jack's embrace, feeling his heart beat against hers, she knew it would be worth every challenge. Because sometimes love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to show up, day after day, willing to do the work of becoming better together. 6 months later, morning arrived with that golden quality of light that Nori had learned to associate with new beginnings. She woke slowly, aware of Jack's heavy arm wrapped around her waist, his deep, regular breathing against her neck, the comforting warmth of that large body pressed against her back. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in that space between sleep and waking, where everything was simple and perfect. Jack stirred, pulling her closer against him. his lips brushing the curve of her shoulder in a still sleepy kiss. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning." Nori turned in his arms, meeting those blue eyes already open, watching her with the same intensity that always made her feel simultaneously vulnerable and completely safe. "You know what time it is?" Jack asked, a smile playing on his lips. Nori looked at the clock on the nightstand. 6:45. "Time to get up?" "Time for coffee," Jack corrected, kissing the tip of her nose before untangling himself with reluctance. "I'll make it." She watched him get out of bed, wearing only sweatpants that hung dangerously low on his hips, revealing the line of his abdomen that she'd mapped with fingers and lips countless times. Even after 6 months together, the sight still made something tighten in her chest. Admiration mixed with gratitude that he'd chosen to stay, work, grow beside her. The last few months hadn't been perfect. It had been work. Constant, sometimes exhausting, frequently frustrating. Jack still had moments where his instinct to fix things took over, where he'd start planning without consulting. But now, when Nori gently pointed it out, he stopped, took a deep breath, apologized, asked how she wanted to handle the situation. It wasn't perfect, but it was real and consistent progress, and Nori had learned to ask for help when she needed it, to accept that allowing Jack to participate didn't diminish her accomplishments. That partnership meant sharing both triumphs and challenges. She got up, put on her robe, and went downstairs to the kitchen, where Jack was already making coffee with the meticulous precision she'd begun to associate with their morning moments. 2 cups, black coffee, 2 spoons of sugar. No cream. "Margaret called yesterday," Nori said, accepting the cup he offered and kissing him softly in thanks. "She wants to organize a bingo night at the center next week. Asked if we can help with setup." "Of course." Jack took a sip of his own coffee, leaning against the counter. "Do we need anything specific? Prizes? Decorations?" She said she already has most things, just needs help moving the tables. Nori smiled. "And before you offer, yes, I'd love your help. Those tables are too heavy for me to move alone." Jack smiled back, that smile that said he'd noticed her conscious effort to ask for help and appreciated it. "Thank you for including me. Always." That had become their mantra. Always. Always ask. Always include. Always communicate, even when it was uncomfortable or seemed unnecessary. Building trust not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent choices day after day. The Walter Caldwell Community Center had become exactly what its namesake had dreamed. The rooms that once stood empty and silent now echoed with life. Laughter, conversations, the sound of cards being shuffled, chess pieces clicking against boards, stories being shared. The walls displayed photographs of community members, their stories captured in words and images that honored lives lived with purpose. Harold came 3 times a week, always bringing a new war story or tale from his youth. Mrs. Patterson taught knitting on Thursday afternoons. Mr. Kim led Tai Chi sessions every morning. Margaret had started a book club that met on Saturdays, and Jack, true to his word, had helped Harold establish the Veterans Oral Archive, but only by providing resources and technical support, never making decisions or taking control. Nori had left the diner, but on friendly terms. She still visited regularly, still had coffee with old customers. But now her work, her passion, was at the center. She was the director officially, with Jack as a volunteer consultant, an arrangement they'd carefully negotiated, establishing clear boundaries about where her authority began and where his role ended. He'd drastically reduced his corporate workload, taking on only selective consulting projects that allowed flexibility. He divided his time between helping at the center, spending time with Nori, and, surprisingly, rediscovering hobbies he'd abandoned years ago. He'd started playing piano again, something he hadn't done since adolescence. The sound of him practicing at night had become a comforting soundtrack for Nori while she worked on her own projects. At 7:13 in the morning, as they'd done almost every day for the past 6 months, Jack and Nori walked together to the diner. It was a tradition they'd started right after the reconciliation, a way to honor Walter, to keep alive the memory of those silent morning coffees that had meant so much. Jack sat on Walter's stool. Nori didn't work there anymore, But the owner still allowed her to make one coffee. Just one. Just for Jack. Just at 7:13. Black coffee. 2 spoons of sugar. No cream. To Walter. Jack said softly, raising the cup in silent toast before taking the first sip. To Walter, Nori echoed, sitting beside him, her own cup in her hands. They stayed like that for 23 minutes. Exactly the time Walter used to stay. It was a sacred ritual for them now. A moment of quiet before the day began. A way to remember where it all started and why. That evening, after the center closed and the last visitors went home, Nori and Jack stood on the front porch, watching the sun set in shades of orange and pink that painted the sky like a work of art. I had a conversation with Sarah today, Jack said casually, but Nori noticed the subtle tension in his voice that suggested this was important. The lawyer? Nori turned to face him. Sarah had become their friend during the process of establishing the center as a non-profit organization. Yes. Jack took a deep breath, and Nori saw his conscious effort preparing to share something instead of simply deciding alone. She mentioned there's an opportunity to expand. An adjacent building is for sale, and we could potentially create more spaces. Maybe art workshops, a small gym for physical therapy, even affordable apartments for seniors. Nori's heart raced. It was exactly the kind of expansion she'd secretly dreamed about but seemed impossible to achieve. That would be amazing. It would be expensive. Would require serious fundraising, maybe loans. Jack took her hand, intertwining their fingers. And before you ask, no. I haven't made any decisions. Haven't talked to banks, haven't consulted investors. Just listened to Sarah explain the opportunity and then stopped. Because this isn't my decision to make alone. It's ours. Tears burned in Nori's eyes, not from sadness, but from pure pride. You really have changed. I'm trying. Every day. He brought their intertwined hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. So what do you think? Is it worth exploring? Yes. Nori smiled, squeezing his fingers. But let's do it right. Together. Every decision, every step. Real partners. Real partners, Jack agreed. They stayed silent for a moment, just absorbing the enormity of what they'd built. Not just the center, but their relationship, the trust they'd rebuilt brick by brick through honest communication and consistent effort. Nori? Jack finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a nervous quality she hadn't heard in months. Yes? He turned to face her completely, both hands holding hers now. I know we've talked about the future, about how neither of us is in a hurry, about how we want to do things at our own pace. Jack, what? But I need to ask you something. And if you say no, or that it's too soon, or that you need more time, that's completely okay. No pressure, no expectations, just an honest question. He was clearly nervous now, the words coming out faster than normal. Nori's heart beat irregularly. You can ask. Jack took a deep breath, his blue eyes fixed on hers with that intensity that always disarmed her. Can you imagine me in your life 5 years from now? 10 years? Forever? Because I can. I can imagine waking up next to you every morning. I can imagine building more community centers with you. I can imagine maybe if you want children who have your huge heart and my stubbornness. I can imagine growing old together, drinking coffee at 7:13 every morning, honoring my grandfather and building our own legacy. Tears were falling freely now. I can imagine that too. So, Jack released one of her hands, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box that made Nori's world tilt on its axis. With all respect for our pace and your autonomy, and our decision not to rush. Nori-chan, will you marry me? Not now, not necessarily soon, but eventually. When we're ready? Because I want to spend the rest of my life asking you what you think before making decisions. I want to build dreams with you. Not for you. I want to be your partner. In everything. Nori looked at the box, still closed in his hands, and then at his face. Vulnerable. Hopeful. Completely open. She thought about all the moments that had brought them here. The silent coffees with Walter. The unexpected house. The fights and reconciliations. The painful but necessary growth. The daily choices to show up, communicate, respect. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, eventually, when we're ready. Yes. Jack opened the box, revealing a simple but beautiful ring. A light blue stone, the same shade as Walter's eyes, surrounded by small diamonds. He slid it onto her finger with slightly trembling hands, and then pulled her into a kiss that was both celebration and promise. When they separated, both laughing and crying at the same time, Jack rested his forehead against hers. Thank you for giving me a second chance, for believing I could change. Thank you for actually doing the work of changing. Nori kissed him softly. For showing me that love isn't about perfection, it's about consistency. 3 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, at 7:13 sharp, Jack walked into the diner as he did almost every day. Nori was there, no longer as an employee but as a visitor, a tradition they faithfully maintained. She already had the coffee ready when he sat down. Black coffee, 2 spoons of sugar, no cream. Good morning, he said, the matching ring now adorning his own finger. They'd decided that both would wear engagement rings, a choice that felt right for them. Good morning, Jack, she replied with that smile he never tired of waiting for, of provoking, of deserving. And as they drank coffee together in that modest diner where it all began, surrounded by the morning life of the waking city, there were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, just 2 people choosing to show up, day after day, building a love that wasn't about perfect happy endings but about consistent beginnings. One day at a time. One coffee at a time. One moment of choosing each other, repeatedly, forever. Because in the end, that's what love really meant. Not the dramatic intensity of grand moments, but the quiet beauty of showing up faithfully, asking instead of assuming, building together instead of alone, honoring the past, while creating a future that would be worth every effort. And there, on that faded red stool where Walter once sat, where the quiet kindness of an elderly man had planted seeds of transformation, Jack and Nori continued the story. Not as an ending, but as a continuous beginning, as love that happened every day. Sometimes life teaches us that the most powerful legacies don't come from grand gestures or accumulated fortunes, but from small acts of kindness repeated day after day. Walter never imagined that his silent coffees at 7:13 in the morning would plant seeds of such profound transformation. He saw in Nori something she couldn't see in herself, the rare ability to make people feel seen, valued, important. And by leaving his house to her, he wasn't just transferring property. He was passing on a responsibility to create spaces where no one feels invisible. Jack learned the hard way that presence matters more than solutions, that true love means respecting the autonomy of those we love, not taking control of their lives. And Nori discovered that accepting help isn't weakness. It's the courage to let someone walk beside you. In the end, their love wasn't built in cinematic moments of perfection, but in daily choices to show up, communicate, grow together. Because the best loves aren't those that never face storms, but those that choose to rebuild together after the storm passes. And you? How many times have you let the fear of being vulnerable push away someone who truly cared? How many times have you chosen loneliness because it seemed safer than risking disappointment again? If this story touched your heart, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, do you believe in second chances in love? You know that feeling of living only half the life you could be living, of being afraid to open up, to trust, to allow someone to really know you? Nori lived that. She spent years making herself invisible to protect herself, until Walter and Jack showed her that being seen, being loved, being chosen, that's worth every risk. If any part of this story echoed in you, if you feel like you're also living at half capacity, afraid to be full, vulnerable, true, I've pinned something in the comments. It's not for everyone, only for those who still believe they deserve to feel alive again, whole again, seen again. For those who still want to feel that their life is theirs to live, not just survive.